Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Forget everything school taught you about slavery in the United States, that two-paragraph summary with cotton plantations and Lincoln saving everyone at the end. The reality was more brutal, more calculated, and more perverse than any textbook ever dared to print. Today, you're going to learn 25 documented facts that America spent centuries trying to bury. Brace yourself, because after this video, you will never look at American history the same way again. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to help us out. Fact number 1. There were farms created exclusively to breed slaves like cattle. They did not produce cotton or tobacco. The product was people. A few men were kept with dozens of enslaved women. The sole purpose, to produce children who were born as the farmer's property. It was human livestock farming with records filed at the courthouse. Virginia became the largest exporter of slaves in the United States. When the tobacco plantation soil was depleted, the farmers found a new business, selling human beings to the Deep South. Families torn apart by force, mothers ripped from their children, shipped in chains to Mississippi and Louisiana. The domestic trade moved hundreds of thousands of people. Merchants bought in Virginia at low prices and resold in Alabama and Mississippi at a 300% profit. There were fixed trade routes for this internal trafficking, with cities functioning as trading posts. Virginia did not sell cotton, it sold people. Entire cities lived off this economy. Richmond was the largest slave trading center in the Upper South. Slavery was not just forced labor. It was a financial market with pricing, profit margins, and organized logistics. Every baby born on a breeding farm was entered into the ledger as an asset, the accounting of horror. Fact number 2. Slaves were used as guinea pigs for medical experiments, without anesthesia, without consent, without mercy. Dr. James Marion Sims, considered the father of modern gynecology, built his entire reputation by repeatedly operating on enslaved women, testing surgical procedures, with nothing for the pain. One of them, named Anarcha, was subjected to 30 surgeries before Sims considered the procedure successful. 30 times cut open without anesthesia. Sims recorded the results, like someone logging tests on laboratory animals. The women did not even have the right to scream stop. They were guinea pigs with names. Sims was not an exception. He was the system. Owners lent slaves to doctors who needed bodies to practice on. If they died during the experiments, the owner received compensation for the loss. Modern American medicine was literally built on the suffering of people treated as disposable material. To this day, statues of Sims exist in American cities. America honors the surgeon and forgot the patients. The women who suffered at his hands did not even have their last names recorded in the medical charts. Only the first names survived. Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy. Names without a grave, without a headstone, without justice. In 2018, the statue of Sims in Central Park in New York was finally removed after years of protests. But dozens of hospitals, medical schools, and scientific awards still carry his name across the country. Science celebrates the result and ignores the method. The scalpel cleaned the blood, but history did not. Sims was not alone. Medical schools in the South purchased the corpses of slaves for dissection. When corpses ran out, grave robbers raided black cemeteries. The black body was raw material, alive for labor, dead for science. In neither case was it treated as human. Fact number 3. After Nat Turner was executed, his body became a trophy. In 1831, in Southampton County, Virginia, Turner led the most violent slave revolt in American history. About 60 white people died in 2 days of chaos before the local militia crushed the rebellion with disproportionate brutality. Turner was captured 2 months later, tried, and publicly hanged. The punishment did not end with death. His body was handed over to doctors. His skin was stripped and turned into bags. His bones were distributed as souvenirs. Body parts circulated as macabre curiosities for decades. The retaliation did not only target Turner. White militias killed more than 200 black people in the region, most with no connection whatsoever to the revolt. Laws were tightened across the entire South, banning gatherings and literacy. Revolting did not just cost a life, it cost the freedom of millions for entire decades. Fact number 4. Slaves were branded with a hot iron on the face, like cattle. In Louisiana, the Code Noir of 1724 officially allowed owners to brand slaves with a red-hot iron for attempted escape. This was not informal punishment decided by an overseer. It was written law, published, and enforced by courts. The owner's initials were burned directly onto the skin, often on the face, so the brand would be visible from a distance. On the first escape, the iron. On the second, the cutting of the ear. On the third, the severing of the Achilles tendon, making any new escape attempt physically impossible forever. Branding irons were custom ordered from local blacksmiths, each one bearing the owner's initials. Some farmers kept them hanging on the office wall as a display of authority. The slave's body was a walking message to the others. Try to run, and you will carry the mark until your last day. Besides the iron, there was the whip. Overseers used whips made of braided rawhide with sharpened metal tips. 100 lashes could strip the skin off an entire back, leaving the flesh exposed. Salt and pepper were rubbed into the open wounds to increase the pain and prevent infection. The line between punishment and torture never existed. Instruments of torture were mass-produced and sold in commercial catalogs. Iron collars with spikes that prevented the slave from lying down, metal masks that prevented eating or speaking, shackles with chains of varying weight depending on the offense. Cruelty was industrialized. It had a factory, a price, and delivery. Fact number 5. There were killer dogs bred exclusively to hunt fugitive slaves. These were not ordinary guard dogs. They were animals selected from puppyhood to track, chase, and attack human beings in the darkness, trained to bite and hold without killing, because a dead slave was not worth any money. The hunt became an industry. Professionals called slave catchers offered their services with trained packs and charged per head recovered. Advertisements in the newspapers of the time described scars, branding marks, and rewards in dollars for escaped human beings. Every slave recovered was guaranteed profit. For the slave system, a man running through the forest at night was not a person seeking freedom. He was merchandise on the run. The dogs were a tool for recovering lost investment. The barking echoing in the distance in the middle of the night was the sound of pure terror for any slave who dared to run through the darkness. Harriet Tubman, the most famous woman of the Underground Railroad, made 13 trips to the South and rescued about 70 slaves. She carried a revolver, not for the hunters, but for any fugitive who wanted to give up and go back. Going back meant informing on the others. Tubman never lost a passenger. Fact number 6. Killing a slave was not a crime in colonial Virginia. A law from 1669 expressly stated that if a slave died during a physical correction administered by the master, that death would not be considered a crime under any circumstances. The official justification was simple: nobody would destroy their own property on purpose. If the slave died under torture, the owner was considered the victim because he lost valuable property. The dead slave had no right to justice because he legally never had a right to anything. The law protected the financial investment, not the human life. Variations of this legislation existed in every slaveholding state. In 1705, Virginia went further and officially declared slaves as real property. They held the same legal status as houses and land. They could be inherited, mortgaged, and confiscated for the owner's debts. The American legal system turned people into spreadsheet columns. The spreadsheet never recorded the suffering. Fact number 7. Doctors invented fictitious diseases to scientifically justify slavery. In 1851, Dr. Samuel Cartwright described drapetomania, a supposed mental illness that made slaves want to run away from their masters. The recommended cure: regular whipping and amputation of toes. The same Cartwright invented dysesthesia ethiopica, which supposedly made slaves lazy and inattentive to work. The prescribed cure was even more intense forced labor. Wanting freedom was considered a mental illness. Being exhausted from working 18 hours a day was pathological laziness. American science in the 19th century did not merely tolerate slavery, it invented medical diagnoses to justify it. Medicine served as a powerful ideological weapon. Articles were published in respected scientific journals. Doctors educated at prestigious universities signed off on them. Racism put on a white coat, and nobody questioned it. Scientists of the era measured skulls to prove white superiority. They published tables comparing brain volumes across races. The conclusions were always the same: black people were biologically inferior. This pseudoscience fueled laws, policies, and prejudices that survived for more than a century after abolition. Fact number 8. Slaves were punished for showing sadness. Crying was forbidden. Showing grief for a family member who had been sold was considered insubordination. There are records of a mother who had her son sold and was whipped for being unable to stop crying. The owner would not tolerate seeing sad faces among his slaves. Slaves were forced to sing while working in the fields, so overseers could monitor whether they were alert and obedient. Silence was considered suspicious. Crying was treated as rebellion. Even facial expression was the master's property. The system controlled body, mind, and emotion simultaneously. Slavery did not just steal physical freedom. It stole the right to feel, the right to cry for a child sold at auction, the right to be silent when the pain was too great to bear, the right to have a sad face, when even tears are forbidden by law, what remains of a human in a human being. Fact number 9. Enslaved children began working at 2 or 3 years of age. This is not an exaggeration. Boys and girls barely out of diapers were already carrying water, pulling weeds in the fields, and caring for babies even younger than themselves. Childhood did not exist for an enslaved child. By age 6, they were already working in the cotton fields under the scorching sun. The clock of forced labor started the moment a child learned to walk, and these children were sold separately from their mothers at public auctions, without any hesitation. Profit did not wait for childhood to end. Auctions included children of all ages displayed on a stage. Buyers examined teeth, muscles, and health like someone buying an animal at the market. Mothers watched their children being taken away by strangers and never saw them again. The black family was something that could be dismantled and sold in separate pieces. The largest slave market was in New Orleans. More than 100,000 people were sold there between 1830 and 1860. Slaves stood on a stage, turned around for the buyers, opened their mouths to show their teeth. Women were groped by men assessing reproductive capacity. Trade in human beings with an invoice. The building of the largest slave market in New Orleans still exists. Today, it is a luxury hotel. Tourists sleep where entire families were destroyed and sold in pieces. America turned its worst horrors into tourist attractions without changing the sign. The floor that absorbed tears now absorbs tips. Fact number 10. There was a reverse underground railroad that kidnapped free black people from the North and sold them as slaves in the South. An organized criminal network captured people who had already legally won their freedom, forged documents, and sold them back into captivity in the Deep South. Solomon Northup is the most famous case. Born free in New York, a respected musician, he was lured by a fake job offer, drugged in a hotel, and sold as a slave in Louisiana. He spent 12 years in captivity before he was able to prove his identity. But Solomon was lucky. The majority never came back. They disappeared forever into the plantations of the Deep South, with no record that they had ever been free people. The freedom of a black person in 19th century America was as fragile as the paper it was written on. All it took was an armed kidnapper and a wagon ride to erase everything from an entire life. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made everything worse. The federal law required northern states to return fugitive slaves to their owners in the South. Citizens who helped a fugitive could be arrested and fined. The North, which called itself free, was forced by law to be an accomplice. Freedom had a border, and the border moved. Free black people walked around with freedom papers sewn into their clothing. Even so, Southern courts frequently ignored the evidence and declared the person a slave. The word of a white man was worth more than any document. The paper guaranteed freedom. The system guaranteed the paper was worth nothing. Fact number 11. Slave quarters were designed to maximize suffering and minimize costs. Single-room cabins housed 10 or 12 people crammed together. Dirt floors, no windows, no ventilation whatsoever. In the summer, they became ovens. In the winter, the biting cold came through every crack. Children slept on the floor piled on top of each other. Food was rationed to the minimum. Ground corn, scraps of meat, and little more. Records from the era show that slaves received fewer calories per day than prisoners of war in modern conflicts. The quarters were not housing. They were a labor storage facility. Respiratory diseases, skin infections, and intestinal parasites were constant among slaves. The life expectancy of a field slave was 21 to 22 years after the start of forced labor. They worked until the body literally stopped functioning, and when it stopped, they were replaced by another. The sugar plantations of Louisiana were the worst. The work was so brutal that life expectancy dropped to 7 years after arrival. 7 years. Owners calculated that it was cheaper to buy new slaves than to take care of the ones they already had. The human body was a disposable part in a machine that only produced profit. Fact number 12. Slaves were legally forbidden from reading, writing, gathering in groups, or officially marrying. The slave codes prohibited any form of education, possession of weapons, meetings without the presence of a white person, and leaving the property without the master's written permission. Forced illiteracy was a weapon of control. Teaching a slave to read was a crime punishable by law in every southern state. In North Carolina, a heavy fine and imprisonment. In Georgia, a $500 fine. A fortune for the time. A slave who cannot read does not organize. One who cannot gather does not conspire. That was the cold calculation of the system. Frederick Douglass learned to read in secret from his master's wife when he was a child. When the owner found out, he immediately forbade it. A black man who knows how to read is no longer fit to be a slave, he said. Douglass escaped and used the written word to set the abolitionist movement on fire. The owner was right to be afraid. Douglass was not the only one. Thousands of slaves learned to read in secret over the decades, risking whippings, mutilation, and death if they were discovered. They hid stolen books in holes dug in the floors of their cabins. They practiced letters in the sand at night and erased the traces before dawn. The alphabet was the most dangerous weapon a slave could possess. Fact number 13. A slave mailed himself inside a wooden crate to escape slavery. In 1849, Henry Brown folded himself into a crate about 3 feet by 2 feet. He carried only a flask of water and a drill to make air holes. He was shipped from Richmond to Philadelphia. The journey lasted 27 hours of pure terror. The crate was turned upside down several times during transport. Brown nearly died from lack of air and from blood pooling in his head. He heard men sit on the crate without knowing there was a human being inside. About 250 miles folded up in the dark. When the crate was opened in Philadelphia, Brown stumbled out, drenched in sweat, and said, "How do you do, gentlemen?" He became known forever as Henry Box Brown, the man who mailed himself to freedom about 250 miles inside a crate. The creativity of human desperation knows no limits. Fact number 14. Slave owners created an edited version of the Bible specifically for slaves. They deliberately removed most of the Old Testament and large sections of the New. Every single reference to the Israelites' escape from Egypt, to liberation, and to divine justice was cut out. They kept only the verses that normalized obedience and submission to the master. The faith that could have been a source of hope and revolt became just another chain of control, and anyone who managed to read the complete Bible discovered the truth, which is precisely why reading was forbidden. The system controlled even the Word of God. But the slaves created their own faith. In secret worship services held at night in the forests, they blended Christianity with African traditions. The spirituals, songs that still exist, contained coded messages about escape routes. Wade in the water meant walk through the water to throw off the dogs. Faith resisted the control. Fact number 15. In 1860, slaves were worth more than all the gold, silver, and currency in circulation in the United States combined. Total value of slaves, $4 billion. All the gold and silver in the country, $228 million. All the currency in circulation, $435 million. Converted to current values, that would be about $13 trillion. Slaves were the most valuable financial asset in America, worth more than all the banks, all the factories, and all the railroads combined. The cotton harvested by enslaved hands represented 60% of all American exports. Nobody surrenders $13 trillion without fighting to the death. The South chose total war over economic collapse. 620,000 Americans died on the battlefields, more than in all American wars combined up to Vietnam. The Civil War was not just a fight for freedom, it was the largest economic dispute in history. And when the war ended, the former slaves received practically nothing. The promise of 40 acres and a mule never materialized for the majority. 4 million people were freed without land, without money, without education, and in a country that still hated them. Freedom came without an instruction manual. Fact number 16. The White House was built by enslaved hands. Records show that more than 200 enslaved people worked on the construction of the White House and the American Capitol. The buildings, where presidents signed laws and speeches about freedom, were raised by those who had none. A large part of the infrastructure of Washington was built with slave labor: roads, bridges, public buildings, monuments. The official records show payments made directly to the owners, never to the workers. The slave cut the stone, the owner received the wages. The irony is not subtle, it is structural. 12 of the first 18 American presidents personally owned slaves. The capital of freedom in the world was built by the most enslaved workforce on the continent. The literal foundation of American democracy was constructed by people whom that very democracy legally classified as property. Fact number 17. The North profited enormously from Southern slavery. The idea that the North was innocent and morally superior is convenient, but completely false. New York banks financed plantations. Massachusetts factories processed cotton picked by slaves. Connecticut insurance companies sold policies on the lives of slaves. Wall Street was literally next to one of the largest slave markets in New York. The money that built the most powerful financial center in the world has blood in its foundation. Slavery in New York was only fully abolished in 1827. Until that date, slaves were bought and sold in Manhattan. The North did not free the slaves out of kindness or moral conviction. It freed them because industrialization created more profitable and efficient ways to exploit cheap labor. Slavery became less profitable than factory minimum wages. Profit always came first, before and after abolition. Fact number 18. The first slave owner legally recognized by a court in the United States was black. Anthony Johnson, a former servant of African origin, owned a 250-acre farm in Virginia in the 1650s. In 1654, a court recognized his right over John Casor as a servant for life. In the first decades of the colony, race was not yet the sole criterion for enslavement. White and black people served side by side as temporary servants. Decades later, the laws hardened and slavery became exclusively racial and hereditary. The Johnson case shows that the system was a deliberate construction, law by law. In 1662, Virginia passed the law Partus Sequitur Ventrum. The condition of the child followed that of the mother. If the mother was a slave, the child was born a slave, regardless of who the father was. Owners who impregnated enslaved women profited twice. They generated free labor with their own blood. The law turned abuse into investment. Fact number 19. Native American nations also owned black slaves. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole held thousands of enslaved people on their lands. The Cherokee alone owned about 600 slaves at the beginning of the 19th century, a number that rose to 1,500 by the Trail of Tears. When the Civil War ended, some native nations openly resisted the emancipation of slaves. The Cherokee only granted tribal citizenship to former slaves after intense pressure from the federal government. Slavery did not respect simple racial lines. It was a system that infected and corrupted multiple cultures on the continent. The descendants of those slaves, the Cherokee freedmen, fought for decades to be recognized as members of the Cherokee Nation. Only in 2021 did a federal court confirm their rights. 156 years after abolition, the grandchildren of indigenous slaves were still fighting for recognition. Bureaucracy was the last chain. Fact number 20. Thousands of American towns banned the presence of black people after sunset. They were called sundown towns. It is estimated that up to 10,000 towns between 1890 and 1960 had this rule in effect. Signs at the entrance of towns warned bluntly, "Negro, don't let the sun set on you here." These were not just towns in the Deep South. Illinois, Indiana, and Oregon had hundreds of these towns scattered across their territory. Black people found after curfew faced arrest, beatings, or something much worse. The Green Book, published between 1936 and 1967, listed the few safe places for black travelers. In the middle of the 20th century, black people needed a printed survival manual to cross their own country by car without being attacked. Some towns maintained these segregationist policies informally until the 1970s. Freedom existed on paper. On the road, it depended on the time and the color of your skin. Emmett Till was 14 years old when he was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 for allegedly whistling at a white woman. His body was mutilated beyond recognition. His mother demanded an open casket at the funeral so the world could see what they did to her son. 60,000 people passed by the casket. The photo circulated across the country. The two men accused were acquitted by an all-white jury in just 67 minutes of deliberation. Afterward, protected by the law that prevented a new trial for the same crime, they publicly confessed to the murder in a magazine for $400. American justice was not blind. It saw the color of skin perfectly well. Fact number 21. Only 4 to 6% of enslaved Africans in the transatlantic trade went to the United States. Of the 12.5 million people forced to cross the ocean, about 388,000 went to American territory. The overwhelming majority went to Brazil and the Caribbean. Brazil alone received nearly 5 million enslaved Africans, more than any other country in the world. But if the United States received so few, how did they reach 4 million slaves on the eve of the Civil War? The answer is the breeding farms. The American system bred its enslaved population internally, like cattle. In Brazil and the Caribbean, the slave mortality rate was so high that new Africans had to be constantly imported to replace the dead. In the United States, less importation, more forced breeding. The American system was more efficient at producing enslaved human beings. And efficiency, in this context, is the most obscene word that exists. The Atlantic crossing lasted 6 to 8 weeks of pure horror. Africans were chained in holds with less than 3 feet of height between decks, without light, without air, lying in rows so tight they could not turn over. The mortality rate on slave ships ranged between 15 and 30% of the human cargo. The bodies of those who died during the crossing were thrown into the sea without ceremony. Sharks learned to follow the slave ships. Transatlantic trade routes can still be mapped by the concentration of human bones on the ocean floor. The Atlantic is not just an ocean. It is the largest cemetery without a headstone on the planet. Those who survived the crossing arrived destroyed. They were washed, rubbed with oil to appear healthy, and sold immediately. Wounds were disguised with tar, diseases hidden with herbs. The market demanded a presentable product. The packaging mattered more than the human content inside it. Fact number 22. African knowledge built the wealth of the American South. The rice that made the plantations of South Carolina fabulously rich was not invented by white Europeans. It came directly from Africans of the rice coast of West Africa, where the grain had been cultivated with sophisticated techniques for centuries. Owners bought slaves specifically from regions of Africa where advanced agricultural skills existed. They paid higher prices for them. Sale advertisements in the newspapers specified the region of origin as if it were a quality seal on a product. The slaves were not just brute force, they were the true experts. The same happened with indigo, tobacco, and irrigation techniques. American history recorded the plantation owners as agricultural entrepreneurship geniuses. The true experts who brought the knowledge remained anonymous, chained, and without any credit. Africa planted the knowledge, America harvested the profit and erased the authorship. Fact number 23, African rulers actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade. Before Europeans arrived on the continent, slavery already existed in Africa in various forms. Kings and local merchants sold prisoners of war and political rivals to European traffickers in exchange for weapons, fabrics, and alcohol. This does not diminish European responsibility. They were the ones who created the industrial scale demand in the millions in the transatlantic system. But acknowledging African participation is essential to understanding the full picture. The slave trade was a global system where profit spoke louder than humanity on all sides of the ocean. The Kingdom of Dahomey, in present-day Benin, built an entire economy based on the capture and sale of slaves. Wars were fought specifically to generate tradable prisoners. When England tried to abolish the trade, the King of Dahomey protested. They were destroying his most profitable business. It is estimated that African merchants profited the equivalent of billions of current dollars from the trade over the centuries. European weapons purchased with that profit fueled more wars that generated more prisoners, that generated more sales. A self-feeding cycle of horror that lasted more than 300 years without stopping. Fact number 24. The 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in 1865 contains a loophole that few people know about. The text says, "Except as punishment for a crime duly convicted." All it took was arresting a black man for vagrancy to legally turn him into a forced laborer, from free man to slave in a matter of hours. The convict leasing system that arose from this loophole was, in many cases, worse than slavery itself. Private companies rented prisoners from the states for pennies a day. In slavery, the owner wanted to keep the slave alive. He was expensive property. In convict leasing, if the prisoner died, they simply requested another one. The mortality rate in some mines and railroads reached 40% per year. Chains weighing 11 to 33 pounds fastened to the ankles. Hard labor from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week. Thousands were arrested for crimes that do not even exist today. Vagrancy, public drunkenness, suspicious looks. The roads and railroads built by these chained men still exist and are used to this day. The 13th Amendment abolished the name of slavery. The system adapted quickly and survived with new names. Abolition changed the written law. It did not change the profit. The chains became lighter, but they never disappeared. The legacy of convict leasing is visible today. The United States has the largest prison population in the world, more than 2 million inmates. Black people represent 13% of the population, but 38% of prisoners. Private prisons profit from every inmate. The model changed its name. The logic remained. Fact number 25. George Washington used teeth pulled from slaves in his dentures. The story every American learns in school is that Washington had wooden teeth. That is a lie. His own accounting records from Mount Vernon show the purchase of 9 teeth from Negroes for 122 shillings in 1784. His dentures were made of lead, brass, gold, animal teeth, and possibly teeth pulled from enslaved people on his property. The first president of the United States literally carried pieces of his slaves in his own mouth while giving speeches about freedom and democracy to the world. The myth of wooden teeth is more comfortable than the truth. America rewrote the history of its founder because the reality was too brutal to tell in elementary schools. Washington personally owned more than 300 slaves at Mount Vernon. The freedom he preached had a color and had a price. Washington freed his slaves in his will, but only after the death of his wife Martha. The slaves were supposed to wait for 2 people to die before finally gaining their freedom. Some waited additional decades in that condition. Washington's posthumous generosity was a calculated way of not losing labor during his lifetime. In the end, slavery never truly ended. It only changed form, name, and address, from iron chains to the invisible chains of debt, from cotton plantations to the industrial prison system, from breeding farms to the segregated neighborhoods of major American cities, from sundown towns to institutionalized structural racism, from Dr. Cartwright's fictitious diseases to unconscious bias, from convict leasing to the mass incarceration of millions. The 13th Amendment abolished the name of slavery. The system adapted and survived with new names and new excuses,